Some histories remain untold, some wounds unhealed. Next up, young colored woman, 17 years old, strong back, good teeth, starting bid at $300. The year is 1875, a decade after emancipation, yet freedom remains a hollow promise for many. In the shadows of America's supposed progress, families are still being torn apart, bonds severed by greed and corruption. "Don't take her, she's my only sister." What happens when a black cowboy, a man who carved his own freedom from the unforgiving frontier, discovers his long-lost sister on an auction block? What lengths will he go to when faced with a system designed to keep them both in chains? This isn't just another Western tale. This is the story they didn't want told, of courage that defied an era, of family bonds stronger than iron, and of one man's stand that ignited a change no one thought possible. If this is your first time here, I'm sharing untold stories of black heroes from America's past on the Black Rancher channel. Hit that subscribe button now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales that history tried to erase. Now let's dive into Chapter 1 of a story that will change how you see the American frontier forever. Texas Panhandle, September 1875. Solomon Rivers rode into Greystone with the setting sun at his back, casting his tall shadow far ahead on the dusty main street. At 32, he had the weathered look of a man who'd lived twice those years. His broad shoulders carried the weight of experiences few could imagine, and beneath his worn Stetson, dark eyes missed nothing. The town had changed in the 8 years since he'd last passed through. New buildings lined the once sparse street, and the railroad station on the eastern edge promised connections to places Solomon had only heard about in stories. But some things remained depressingly familiar. The way conversations hushed as he rode by, how white men's hands instinctively moved closer to their holsters, how women pulled their children closer. Solomon guided his chestnut stallion Sovereign toward the livery stable. The horse, like its owner, was exceptional, powerful, intelligent, and worth more than most men in this town would make in a year. Both had been earned through hard work at the R Ranch in Colorado, where Solomon had risen from hired hand-to-head wrangler over 6 years of backbreaking labor. "That's a mighty fine animal," said the stable boy, a freckle-faced kid no more than 14, as Solomon dismounted. "Finest I've ever known," Solomon replied, patting Sovereign's neck. "Take good care of him. Extra oats, fresh water, and a good rub-down. He's earned it." The boy nodded eagerly, clearly impressed by both the horse and the commanding presence of its owner. "3 nights, Solomon said, handing over payment. "I've got business in town." "Yes, sir," the boy responded, then caught himself looking around nervously. Sir wasn't a word folks around here used for colored men. Solomon pretended not to notice the boy's discomfort. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy, sir. I mean Tommy Baker." "Tommy Baker, I'm trusting you with my most valuable possession. Don't make me regret it." The boy straightened his posture. "I won't, Mr. Rivers, Solomon Rivers." As Solomon strode toward the hotel, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step, he felt the weight of the folded telegram in his breast pocket, the reason for his return to a place he'd sworn never to set foot in again. "Mr. Rivers, stop. Found information about your sister. Stop auction happening. Greystone, September 18th. Stop, come quickly. Stop, J. Williams. 8 years of searching, of sending letters to anyone who might have information, of paying good money to trackers and former slave catchers now working as private investigators, and finally a lead." His chest tightened at the thought of Rebecca. She'd been just 9 years old when they were separated, sold to different masters despite their mother's desperate pleas. His little sister with the gap-toothed smile who followed him everywhere, who believed her big brother could fix anything. Solomon hadn't been able to fix that, but he'd be damned if he failed her again. The Frontier Hotel stood 3 stories tall, its fresh paint and clean windows a testament to Greystone's growing prosperity. Solomon pushed through the front doors, ignoring the immediate hush that fell over the lobby. At the front desk, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up, then immediately back down at his ledger. "No vacancies," he said without meeting Solomon's eyes. Solomon placed a gold coin on the counter. The desk clerk's eyes widened slightly. "I believe you do have a room," Solomon said quietly. My name is Solomon Rivers. I received a telegram from J. Williams, who I believe is staying here. The clerk's demeanor changed instantly. Mr. Rivers? Yes, Mr. Williams mentioned you might be arriving. He's paid for your accommodations already. Solomon nodded, taking the key offered to him. Which room is Mr. Williams in? Room 204. Yours is 203, right next door. As Solomon climbed the stairs, he could feel the stares of the hotel patrons burning into his back. A black man in a decent hotel, treated with a semblance of respect. It was more than many could comprehend. But money talked, even in places like Greystone, and Solomon had plenty of it. He knocked on room 204, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones, their old signal. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, white-haired but standing straight as a rail. James Williams had aged considerably since Solomon had last seen him, but the intelligent eyes and firm handshake remained the same. Solomon Rivers, Williams said, ushering him inside. You're a sight for sore eyes. It's been too long, Mr. Williams, Solomon replied, removing his hat as he entered the room. James Williams had been an abolitionist before the war, and afterward he dedicated himself to helping reunite families torn apart by slavery. He'd helped Solomon gain his freedom papers, taught him to read and write, and set him on the path that had led to his current success. I came as soon as I got your telegram, Solomon said, taking a seat at the small table by the window. Tell me everything. Williams poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one toward Solomon. It's definitely her, Sewell. I've been tracking a group operating in the shadows, former slave traders who found ways around the law. They're holding private auctions, selling people who are technically free but caught in debt traps or legal loopholes. Solomon's jaw tightened. And Rebecca? She was working as a house servant for the Montgomery family in Louisiana. When the old man died, the son sold off everything to pay debts, including the servants. He called it transferring employment contracts, but it's slavery by another name. Where is she now? They're holding the people at a warehouse on the edge of town. Auctions tomorrow morning. Williams pulled out a worn leather folder. I've got documentation proving she's a free woman and your sister, birth records, affidavits from your former plantation, but these men don't care about paper or law. Solomon took a long sip of whiskey, feeling the burn down his throat. Then we'll make them care. There's more, Williams said, his voice dropping. This isn't just about Rebecca. There are 23 people scheduled for that auction tomorrow. Men, women, children, Solomon. Solomon set his glass down, meeting Williams' gaze. Then we'd better get to work. Dawn broke over Greystone with a brilliant orange glow that belied the darkness Solomon felt as he and Williams approached the warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building sat isolated from the rest, deliberately positioned away from prying eyes and decent folk who might question what transpired inside. They move them in before first light, Williams whispered as they observed from behind a stack of lumber across the dusty road. And they've got at least 4 armed guards. Solomon nodded, his experienced eyes picking out details Williams might have missed. The freshly oiled hinges on the side door, suggesting frequent use. The water troughs positioned strategically for horses, the small high windows with iron bars. They've done this before, Solomon muttered. Many times. For 2 hours they watched the comings and goings, supply wagons bringing food and water, well-dressed men arriving early to inspect the merchandise before the auction. Solomon's blood boiled at the calculated efficiency of it all, at how little had changed despite the war and the supposed freedom it had brought. I count 8 men involved in the operation, Solomon said eventually, plus whatever buyers show up later. Williams nodded grimly. Too many for a direct confrontation. I didn't come all this way to leave empty-handed. Solomon's voice was steel. I know that look, Williams sighed. What are you thinking? Solomon's eyes never left the warehouse. I need to see inside. Confirm Rebecca is there. Understand the layout. That's suicide, Sewell. Not if I have a reason to be there. Solomon turned to Williams. How much cash do you have on hand? Williams frowned. About $800. Why? Because you're about to become a buyer, and I'm about to become your property. The plan formed quickly. Williams would pose as a wealthy rancher from Colorado looking to invest in labor for his expanding operation. Solomon would play the part of his current servant, there to help evaluate potential purchases. "It's too dangerous," Williams protested. "If they recognize either of us—" "They won't," Solomon cut him off. "These men see what they expect to see." A rich white man and his obedient Negro? They won't look twice. An hour later, Williams walked confidently toward the warehouse entrance, dressed in his finest clothes, gold watch chain visible across his vest. Solomon followed 3 paces behind, eyes downcast, wearing the plain clothes of a servant rather than his usual quality attire. The guard at the door eyed them suspiciously. "Can I help you, sir?" "James Whitaker," Williams said, adopting the confident drawl of a successful rancher. "Triple R Ranch out of Colorado. Heard you boys might have some solutions to my labor shortage." The guard's posture relaxed slightly at the mention of money. "Auction doesn't start till noon, Mr. Whitaker." "I prefer to examine potential investments thoroughly before bidding," Williams replied, slipping the man a $10 gold piece. "Saves everyone time." The guard pocketed the money and stepped aside. "Through the main floor, office is to the right. Mr. Hardin will assist you." As they entered, the stench hit Solomon immediately. The unmistakable smell of too many people kept in too small a space, of fear and poor sanitation. He kept his face impassive, even as rage built inside him. The warehouse had been divided into sections. The front contained an auction block and rows of chairs for buyers. Beyond that, wooden pens had been constructed, not unlike cattle pens at a stockyard, each holding 5 to 6 people. Solomon's eyes scanned each face as they walked, searching for Rebecca while maintaining his subservient pose. Most of the captives avoided eye contact, a learned behavior from years of servitude. Some showed signs of recent beatings, others of malnutrition. A heavy-set man with a meticulously trimmed beard emerged from the office, extending his hand to Williams. "Arnold Hardin. Welcome to our establishment, Mr. Whitaker." "Pleasure," Williams replied. "I'm in the market for strong workers, men primarily, though I might consider a woman if she's sturdy enough for ranch work." "You've come to the right place," Hardin smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. "We have excellent specimens today. Any particular skills you're seeking?" "Horsemanship would be valuable," Williams said. "My man here will help evaluate their physical condition. He's got an eye for detecting laziness and dishonesty." Hardin glanced at Solomon with mild interest. "Well trained, is he?" "Cost me a pretty penny, but worth every dollar," Williams replied. "Follow me then." Hardin led them through the warehouse, describing each lot as they passed, speaking of human beings as if they were livestock. And then Solomon saw her. In the furthest pen, seated on a wooden bench with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, was Rebecca. At 17, she'd grown into a young woman, but Solomon would know his sister anywhere. She had their mother's high cheekbones and delicate nose, their father's determined chin. Her hair was tied back with a faded ribbon, and though her dress was worn, it was clean. Solomon's chest tightened. He wanted to call out to her, to break his cover, and take her away from this hellish place immediately. But that would endanger not only their lives, but everyone else trapped in this warehouse. "That one," Williams said, following Solomon's gaze. "The girl in the back." "What's her story?" Hardin shrugged. "Household servant, supposedly. Been with the same family since she was a child. They claim she's skilled with sewing and cooking, but we haven't verified. Starting bid is $300. Williams feigned consideration. "She looks delicate. I need workers who won't break." "Perhaps one of the men would better suit your needs," Hardin suggested. As they moved on, Solomon committed every detail of the warehouse to memory: the number of guards, their positions, the locks on the pens, potential exits. Most importantly, he'd found Rebecca. She was alive, and tomorrow she would be free. Outside again, walking back toward town, Williams finally spoke. "Well?" "It's her," Solomon said, his voice tight with emotion. "And we're getting every single person out of that place." Hey, it's the Black Rancher bringing you stories that history tried to erase. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and family bonds in the Old West, Make sure you hit that subscribe button and share this video. Now back to our story. Dusk fell over Greystone as Solomon, Williams, and a third man gathered in Williams' hotel room. Sheriff Thomas Parker wasn't what anyone would call a brave man, but he was an honest one, rare enough in these parts. "This is a serious accusation, gentlemen," Parker said, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. "Mr. Hardin has influential friends in this county." "We're not asking you to arrest him, Sheriff," Solomon said, "just to be present with proper documentation when we expose what's happening." Williams spread the papers on the table, legal documents proving that Rebecca Rivers and at least 3 others at the warehouse were legally free citizens being held against their will. "Unlawful detention is still a crime in Texas, isn't it?" Williams asked. Parker sighed. "It is, but proving it will be our concern," Solomon interrupted. "All we need is for you to witness and enforce the law once evidence is presented." The sheriff looked from Solomon to Williams and back again. "If you're right about this, there'll be hell to pay, not just from Hardin, but from every buyer who shows up tomorrow expecting to purchase workers." "And if we're wrong," Solomon said evenly, "you've simply done your duty verifying the legal status of a business transaction." After the sheriff left, Williams locked the door and turned to Solomon. "He'll show up, but he won't intervene unless it's absolutely clear the law is being broken." "That's all we need," Solomon replied, rolling out a rough sketch of the warehouse on the table. "Now, let's finalize our plan." Through the night, they meticulously prepared. Solomon cleaned and checked his Colt revolver, while Williams visited the telegraph office to send urgent messages to allies in neighboring towns. They prepared duplicate copies of all documentation and divided their money into separate pouches. By morning, both men were exhausted but resolved. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. It was about every person in that warehouse and the countless others who would follow if operations like Hardin's were allowed to continue. Solomon knelt by the window as dawn broke, saying a silent prayer, something he hadn't done since watching his mother being sold away 15 years earlier. "We're ready," Williams said, placing a hand on Solomon's shoulder. Solomon nodded, rising to his feet. "Let's go get my sister." The auction was scheduled for noon, but by 10 o'clock, potential buyers were already gathering outside the warehouse. Solomon and Williams positioned themselves across the street, watching as well-dressed men from surrounding counties arrived on horseback and in carriages. At 11, Sheriff Parker appeared, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best rather than his usual work clothes. He gave them a nearly imperceptible nod as he passed. "He'll do his part," Williams murmured. "He'd better," Solomon replied, adjusting his coat to ensure easy access to his revolver. At precisely 11:30, they made their move. Solomon strode directly toward the warehouse entrance, no longer adopting the subservient posture of the previous day. Williams followed, carrying a leather portfolio containing their documentation. The same guard from yesterday blocked their path. "Auction doesn't start for another half hour, gents." "We're not here for the auction," Solomon said, his voice clear and confident. "We're here to claim stolen property." The guard's hand moved to his gun. "What are you talking about?" "He means," Williams interjected smoothly, "that we have evidence that some of the individuals being held for auction today are legally free citizens." "You'd better step back," the guard warned, now fully alert. "Is there a problem here?" Sheriff Parker approached, badge visible on his chest. The guard relaxed slightly at the sight of law enforcement. "These men are causing a disturbance, Sheriff." "We're attempting to prevent a crime," Williams corrected, opening his portfolio. "Sheriff, we have documentation proving that at least 4 people scheduled for auction today are free citizens being held against their will." Parker examined the papers with exaggerated care, aware of the growing crowd of onlookers. "These appear to be in order. I'll need to speak with Mr. Hardin about this matter." The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. More potential buyers had arrived, watching the scene unfold with curiosity and concern. Inside, they found Hardin directing workers as they prepared the auction area. His smile vanished when he saw Solomon, Williams, and the sheriff approaching. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Mr. Hardin," Parker began formally, "these gentlemen have presented documentation suggesting some individuals in your inventory are free citizens being unlawfully detained." Hardin's face flushed. That's preposterous. Every person here is legally contracted labor. Then you won't mind if we verify that, Williams said, extracting a specific document. Starting with Rebecca Rivers. Solomon stepped forward. My sister. A dangerous silence fell over the warehouse. The guards tensed, hands moving to their weapons. I don't know what game you're playing, Hardin said, his voice low and threatening, but you're disrupting a legitimate business enterprise. I'll have to ask you to leave immediately. This is no game, Solomon replied, meeting Hardin's gaze unflinchingly. Rebecca Rivers is a free woman unlawfully detained for sale, as are Jacob Turner, Mary Washington, and Samuel Green. He named the others they'd identified from Williams's research. Sheriff, Hardin appealed, remove these men from my property. Parker shifted uncomfortably. The documentation appears legitimate, Mr. Hardin. I'm obliged to investigate their claims. This is absurd, Hardin exploded. You have no right. We have every right, Solomon interrupted, his voice carrying through the warehouse. And if you refuse to produce these individuals for verification of their status, you'll be arrested for obstruction of justice. The captives in their pens had gone completely silent, watching the confrontation with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Hardin's face contorted with rage. Then, suddenly, he smiled. Fine. Check your documents. Examine whoever you want, but you'll find everything here is perfectly legal. He gestured to one of his men. Bring out lot 17. Minutes later, Rebecca was brought forward, confusion and fear evident on her face. Solomon's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to maintain his composure. This girl is contracted labor, Hardin insisted, sold to me legally by her previous employer. She is Rebecca Rivers, Williams countered. Born free to Elijah and Sarah Rivers in 1858, as these birth records confirm. She was unlawfully separated from her family and held in servitude despite emancipation. Rebecca's eyes widened as she looked at Solomon, recognition dawning on her face. Soul? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Solomon nodded, fighting back tears. It's me, Becca. This is very touching, Hardin sneered, but it proves nothing. Anyone can forge documents. Perhaps, Sheriff Parker said, but these appear authentic to me, and there's a simple way to resolve this. He turned to Rebecca. Miss, do you know this man? Rebecca's eyes never left Solomon's face. He's my brother, Solomon Rivers. We were separated when I was 9 years old. He taught me to count by shooting stars. A detail no one could have known. No one could have coached her on. Solomon felt a tear slide down his cheek. That's not proof of freedom, Hardin protested. No, Williams agreed, but this is. He produced a freedom certificate with Rebecca's name, countersigned by a federal judge. Sheriff Parker examined it carefully. This appears to be an order, Mr. Hardin. The girl is legally free. Hardin's composure cracked. This is one isolated case. The rest of my inventory is legitimate. We have similar documentation for 3 others, Williams said calmly, and I suspect if we examined each case carefully, we'd find more irregularities. The atmosphere in the warehouse had shifted. Potential buyers were quietly withdrawing, wanting no part of what was increasingly looking like an illegal operation. This auction is suspended pending full investigation, Sheriff Parker announced, finding his courage as the tide turned. You can't do this, Hardin shouted. Do you know how much money I've invested? Do you know the penalty for trafficking free citizens? Williams countered. Rebecca took a hesitant step toward Solomon, then another until she was standing directly before him. You came for me, she said, wonder in her voice. I never stopped looking, Solomon replied. Hardin, seeing his business collapsing before his eyes, made a desperate decision. He lunged forward, grabbing Rebecca and pressing a derringer to her temple. Nobody moves, he shouted, or the girl dies right here. The warehouse froze in a tableau of tension. Solomon stood absolutely still, his eyes locked on Hardin's finger against the trigger of the small pistol pressed to Rebecca's temple. Easy now, Sheriff Parker said, raising his hands placatingly. Let's not do anything rash. "Shut up," Hardin spat, backing toward the office, dragging Rebecca with him. "This is all your fault," he hissed at Solomon. "You and your bleeding heart friend." Solomon's mind raced. The Derringer held only 2 shots, potentially deadly at this range, but Hardin was agitated, his hand trembling slightly, a risk to Rebecca either way. "Mr. Hardin," Solomon said, his voice deliberately calm, "this doesn't need to end badly for anyone." "It already has," Hardin sneered. "You've destroyed everything I've built." "You built it on stolen lives," Williams interjected. "Business," Hardin corrected. "Just business. Everyone profits. The plantations get rid of surplus workers. I make a commission, buyers get labor at fair market prices." "And the people?" Solomon asked. "What do they get?" "Purpose," Hardin said, as if explaining to a child. "Structure. What else would they do with freedom? Farm dirt patches until they starve. At least this way they're fed, housed, useful." Rebecca's eyes met Solomon's. Despite her fear, he could see a spark there, the same stubborn determination he remembered from their childhood. "Tell him, girl," Hardin prodded, pressing the gun harder against her head. "Tell them how good you had it with the Montgomerys. 3 meals a day, a roof over your head." Rebecca's voice was soft but clear. "And no right to my own children if I had any. No right to learn to read. No pay for my work. No future beyond serving until I died." Hardin's grip tightened. "Ungrateful." "Mr. Hardin," Solomon interrupted, taking a careful step forward. "You still have a way out of this. Let my sister go, and you can leave. Take whatever money you have, and start fresh somewhere else. So you can hunt me down later. I'm not a fool." "No, you're a businessman," Solomon countered. "So think like one. What's the profitable move here? Die in this warehouse over one girl, or live to build another enterprise elsewhere?" Doubt flickered across Hardin's face. "He's stalling," Hardin said suddenly. "Where are the rest of your men, Rivers? You must have brought help." "No help," Solomon replied truthfully. "Just me, looking for my sister." Rebecca's eyes never left Solomon's face. Something passed between them. An unspoken communication, the kind only siblings separated by tragedy but bound by blood could share. "You know what I remember most about you, Saul," Rebecca said, her voice stronger now. "How you taught me to be brave. How you said fear was just a feeling, not a fact." Solomon nodded, understanding immediately. "That's right, Becca. Fear is just a feeling." In a flash of movement, Rebecca suddenly went limp, dropping her full weight downward. Startled, Hardin's grip loosened just enough, his aim shifting upward as she fell. Solomon drew and fired in one fluid motion. The report of the Colt revolver echoed through the warehouse like thunder. Hardin staggered backward, his Derringer discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he collapsed, a red stain spreading across his chest. Guards reached for their weapons, but froze as Sheriff Parker and Williams both drew guns of their own. "Nobody needs to die today," Parker shouted. "Weapons down now." For a tense moment, it could have gone either way. Then, one by one, the guards laid their guns on the ground. Solomon rushed forward, gathering Rebecca into his arms, shielding her from the sight of the wounded Hardin. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, trembling but unharmed. "You came for me," she repeated, clutching his coat. "You really came." "I promised Mom I'd look after you," Solomon said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry it took so long." As Parker and Williams secured the guards, the warehouse erupted into activity. The captives in their pens began calling out, some weeping, others demanding to be released. Solomon held Rebecca at arm's length, looking her over. "When we leave here, you'll never have to fear being sold again. You have my word." "What about the others?" Rebecca asked, looking around at the filled pens. Solomon followed her gaze, seeing desperate faces looking back at him, people who had been living with the same fear Rebecca had, who had no brothers searching for them, no documentation to prove their freedom. "We can't just leave them," Rebecca insisted. Solomon nodded slowly, understanding. This had begun as a mission to save his sister, but it had become something more. "Sheriff," he called to Parker, who was examining Hardin's wound. "This man was trafficking in human beings against their will. Every person in this warehouse needs to be released, pending investigation into their status." Parker looked uncertain. "That's not how the law works, Mr. Rivers. Without documentation—" "The law," Solomon interrupted, his voice rising. "The law said my sister and I should be property. The law looked away when families were torn apart. Sometimes the law needs to catch up to justice." Williams stepped forward, placing a hand on Parker's shoulder. "Sheriff, there's precedent for this. After the war, in cases of disputed status, the burden of proof falls on those claiming right to service, not on those being held." Parker hesitated, looking around at the expectant faces. "Don't take her. She's my only sister," Solomon suddenly shouted, his voice echoing through the rafters of the warehouse. Every eye turned to him. "That's what I was prepared to yell when I saw Rebecca on that auction block. But now I see, every person here is someone's sister, someone's brother, someone's child." He looked directly at Parker. "So I'm saying it for all of them. Don't take them. Don't let this continue." A heavy silence fell over the warehouse. Even the wounded Hardin stopped his moaning to watch the sheriff's reaction. Finally, Parker straightened his shoulders. "Release them," he ordered the remaining guards. "All of them, now." 2 days later, Solomon stood on the train platform, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders as they watched Williams oversee the boarding of 23 newly freed men, women, and children onto cars bound for different destinations. Some had families they hoped to find. Others had skills they could use to build new lives. Each carried a document signed by Sheriff Parker, declaring them free citizens until proven otherwise. Not legally binding throughout the country, perhaps, but enough to provide some protection on their journeys. And each carried something else, money from Solomon's savings, enough to give them a start wherever they were headed. "You don't have to do this," Williams had protested when Solomon first proposed emptying his accounts. "You've done enough already." "Freedom without means is just another kind of trap," Solomon had replied. "I know, I've seen it." Now, as the last of them boarded, an elderly man grasped Solomon's hand. "My grandchildren will know your name, Mr. Rivers. They'll know what happened here." Solomon nodded, humbled. "Make sure they know all the names. Make sure they know we stood together." As the train pulled away, Rebecca leaned against her brother's side. "What happens now?" "Now," Solomon said, "we go home. To the R. I've saved enough to buy my own spread next spring. Land of our own, Becca. No one can ever take that from us." Rebecca smiled, but her expression grew serious. "And what about the others? There must be more warehouses, more auctions." Solomon exchanged a look with Williams. "There are, and now we know how to stop them." Williams nodded. "What happened in Greystone is already spreading by telegraph. 2 similar operations in Louisiana have suddenly closed up shop. People are watching, talking." "It won't end overnight," Solomon acknowledged. "These systems weren't built in a day and they won't fall in a day, but we've struck a blow." "Because you came back for me," Rebecca said quietly. "No," Solomon corrected her. "Because we refuse to accept that some people deserve freedom and others don't. Because we recognize that every life has value beyond its usefulness to someone else." As they walked away from the platform, Solomon noticed something different about the town. People still stared, but some nodded in greeting. A few even smiled. Word had spread about what happened at the warehouse, embellished in some tellings, minimized in others, but impossible to ignore. "Mr. Rivers," a voice called out. They turned to see Tommy Baker, the stable boy, running toward them. "Your horse, sir," the boy panted. "Sovereign. A man offered me $20 to let him take him." Solomon tensed. "What happened?" Tommy straightened proudly. "I told him Sovereign belongs to Mr. Rivers, and he's not for sale at any price." Solomon laughed, genuinely delighted by the boy's loyalty. "Good man, Tommy. And what did this would-be horse thief do then?" "Left in a hurry when I mentioned you were the one who shot Hardin," Tommy grinned. Later, as they rode out of town, Solomon on Sovereign, Rebecca on a gentle mare purchased that morning, she asked him about the shooting. "Do you regret it? Taking a man's life?" Solomon considered this carefully. I regret that it came to that. I regret that he valued profit over people so much that he was willing to die for it. He looked at his sister, at her face turned toward the setting sun. But I don't regret protecting you. I don't regret standing up for what's right even when it costs something. You've changed, Saul, Rebecca observed. The brother I remember was angry at the world. I'm still angry, Solomon admitted, but I've learned to use that anger to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than lash out. He smiled at her. Having something to fight for makes all the difference. As they crested a hill, the vast expanse of the Texas landscape spread before them, golden in the late afternoon light, seemingly endless in its possibilities. Look there, Solomon pointed to the horizon. That's freedom, Becca. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, the right to determine your own path. Rebecca studied the vista, then turned to her brother with tears shining in her eyes. Thank you for watching this powerful story on the Black Rancher channel. If this tale of courage, family bonds, and standing up for what's right moved you, please hit that subscribe button now and share this video with someone who needs to hear these untold stories of the American frontier. Remember, history books often leave out the most important chapters, the stories of brave men and women who fought against injustice even after emancipation. Solomon Rivers may be fictional, but his story represents thousands of real black cowboys and freedmen who carved out their own destiny in the unforgiving West. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Until next time, this is the Black Rancher, reminding you that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about facing fear and standing firm anyway. 6 months later, under a bright spring sky, Solomon stood on a ridge overlooking his newly purchased land, 240 acres of prime Texas rangeland, with a creek running through the eastern section. Beside him, Rebecca sat astride her mare, which she'd named Liberty. "What will you call it?" she asked, gesturing to their property. Solomon smiled. "I was thinking Rivers Crossing, for all the rivers our family had to cross to get here, and all the ones still ahead." Since the confrontation at the warehouse, word had spread throughout the territories. Solomon and Williams had received letters from other freedmen seeking advice on challenging similar operations. Some had succeeded, others had met with resistance and violence. The fight was far from over. "James arrives tomorrow with the first herd," Solomon said. 30 head to start, but we'll grow." Rebecca nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. At 23, she had already lived several lifetimes of hardship, but the months with Solomon had begun to heal old wounds. She was studying reading and mathematics with a determination that made her brother proud. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said that day in the warehouse." "Which part?" "About every person being someone's family, someone worth fighting for." She turned to face him. "I want to help others, Sol, like you helped me." Solomon studied his sister's face, so like their mother's, but with a fire entirely her own. "The circuit judge in Fort Worth mentioned that families are still being separated through legal loopholes," he said carefully. "Children especially. They need advocates who understand both the law and the reality." Rebecca's eyes lit up. "Is he looking for assistance?" "He might be," Solomon replied with a smile. "Especially if that assistant came highly recommended by the man who exposed the Greystone auction ring." A comfortable silence fell between them as they gazed out over their land. In the distance, the framework of their new home was taking shape, built by hands that understood the value of creating something that could be passed down to future generations. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Rebecca asked softly. Solomon reached over and took his sister's hand. "I know she would. She always said we were rivers, meant to keep flowing no matter what obstacles stood in our path." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across what was now their land, Solomon felt a peace he had never known before. The journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, still wrongs to right, but for the first time he wasn't fighting alone. "Come on," he said, turning his horse toward home. "Tomorrow's coming fast, and we've got work to do." Side by side, the Rivers siblings rode toward their future, a future they would build together one day at a time.